Before diving into specific tactics, it's important to understand what makes a person toxic. Toxic individuals often display manipulative, controlling, or negative behaviors that drain the energy of those around them. They might thrive on creating chaos, undermining others, or feeding on attention, whether positive or negative. Smart people, however, don't allow toxic people to control their lives. Instead, they use clever strategies to protect their peace, energy, and mental well-being. Let's explore in detail 13 clever ways smart people deal with toxic people and how you can apply these tactics effectively in your life. Number 1. Set boundaries clearly. Setting boundaries is one of the most fundamental tactics when dealing with toxic individuals. Toxic people often try to invade your personal space, demand your time, and push your emotional limits. Without clear boundaries, they can easily drain your energy and disrupt your life. Define what's acceptable. Identify behaviors you will not tolerate, such as constant criticism, gossip, or manipulation. Communicate assertively. Use clear and firm language when expressing your boundaries. For example, say, "I'm not comfortable discussing this topic. Let's change the subject." Enforce your limits. Consistency is key. If someone crosses a boundary, remind them of it. If they continue, reduce your interaction with them. If a toxic coworker constantly interrupts your work to gossip, firmly state that you have important tasks to complete and can't engage in unimportant or non-work-related conversations during office hours. Number 2. Stay detached emotionally. Toxic people often provoke emotional reactions because it gives them a sense of control over those they interact with. They may use criticism, passive aggressiveness, or even outright hostility to push emotional buttons, hoping to elicit a response that feeds their desire for power. Smart people understand this dynamic well and employ techniques to stay detached emotionally, ensuring that the toxic person doesn't get the satisfaction they seek. Practice emotional distancing. Imagine a mental barrier between yourself and the toxic person. Remind yourself that their negativity is a reflection of them, not you. Breathe before responding. Take a moment to breathe and think before reacting to provocative comments. Focus on logic, not emotion. Respond with facts or neutral statements rather than getting drawn into emotional exchanges. If a family member criticizes you unfairly, instead of getting defensive, calmly say, "I hear your opinion, but I don't agree," and move on. One key approach smart individuals use is recognizing emotional triggers and preparing themselves mentally for interactions with toxic individuals. This preparation involves acknowledging potential provocations and deciding in advance how to respond in a calm and composed manner. By maintaining emotional equilibrium, they not only protect their inner peace, but also disarm the toxic person, who may eventually lose interest when they see their tactics aren't effective. They might visualize different scenarios before engaging with such individuals, mentally rehearsing how they will remain unshaken regardless of the provocation. Additionally, staying detached doesn't mean being cold or indifferent. It means maintaining emotional boundaries while still being respectful. Smart people focus on depersonalizing the toxic behavior, understanding that it's a reflection of the other person's issues rather than their own worth. This shift in perspective helps them remain unaffected by personal attacks. Instead of internalizing negative comments, they remind themselves that such behavior stems from the other person's insecurities and unhappiness. In moments of high tension, practicing mindfulness and deep breathing can further enhance emotional detachment. Mindfulness keeps them present and reduces the likelihood of reacting impulsively. Deep breathing not only calms the mind, but also helps regulate the body's physical response to stress. They remind themselves that their well-being is more important than engaging in a negative exchange, allowing them to stay in control of their emotions. Visualization techniques, such as imagining themselves in a peaceful environment while interacting with the toxic person, can also help reinforce emotional stability. Moreover, smart people cultivate a broader perspective by focusing on long-term goals and values. They know that engaging in petty conflicts with toxic individuals detracts from their energy and focus, which is better spent on meaningful pursuits. By keeping their eyes on the bigger picture, they minimize the emotional impact of these interactions. They often review such encounters afterward, learning from each experience and refining their approach for future situations. Ultimately, by combining mental preparation, mindfulness, visualization, and a shift in perspective, smart people master the art of emotional detachment, leaving toxic individuals powerless in their attempts to provoke. This not only protects their emotional well-being, but also empowers them to handle future encounters with greater ease and confidence. Number 3. Don't engage in drama. Toxic people thrive on drama. They enjoy stirring up conflict and dragging others into unnecessary arguments because it gives them a sense of power and control over the situation. Drama allows them to create chaos, gain attention, and manipulate those around them. Smart people, however, are adept at identifying this behavior and avoid this trap by refusing to engage in drama, thereby maintaining their peace and composure. Stay calm. Don't raise your voice or show frustration. Keeping calm helps you maintain control. Change the topic. If a conversation becomes dramatic, subtly shift the subject to something neutral. Know when to walk away. If things escalate, it's often best to excuse yourself and leave the situation. If a friend starts complaining about another mutual friend, redirect the conversation by saying, "I'm not sure about that, but let's focus on something positive." Instead of being drawn into emotional arguments or petty conflicts, smart individuals focus on staying calm and collected. They understand that reacting emotionally only fuels the toxic person's desire for drama. By keeping their tone neutral and avoiding emotional triggers, they disarm the toxic individual. Additionally, they may use deflection techniques to steer the conversation away from heated topics, ensuring that interactions remain as neutral and productive as possible. When a situation becomes overly dramatic, smart people also know the value of pausing and taking a step back. This pause allows them to assess whether engaging further is worth their energy. If they deem the interaction unproductive or harmful, they tactfully disengage by either changing the subject or politely excusing themselves from the conversation. Moreover, smart people are skilled at setting limits on how much attention and time they give to dramatic individuals. By maintaining these boundaries, they ensure that they are not repeatedly dragged into unnecessary conflicts. This approach not only preserves their energy, but also signals to the toxic person that their attempts at stirring up drama will not be successful. Ultimately, by recognizing drama for what it is, a ploy for attention and control, smart people remain focused on what truly matters. They choose to prioritize their mental and emotional well-being over engaging in needless arguments, leaving toxic individuals without the reaction they crave. Number 4. Use the grey rock method. The grey rock method is a strategy where you make yourself as uninteresting and unresponsive as possible to a toxic person, effectively removing any emotional fuel they might seek. This technique works because toxic individuals often seek drama, attention, or emotional responses to feed their need for validation or control. By adopting a neutral and boring demeanor, you make it difficult for them to gain any satisfaction from interacting with you. To effectively use the grey rock method, smart people ensure they provide minimal emotional reactions, keep their responses short, and devoid of enthusiasm, and avoid sharing personal information that the toxic person might use later. This approach works especially well in environments where complete avoidance of the toxic individual is not possible, such as at work or in family gatherings. Be neutral. Respond to toxic individuals with short, bland answers. Avoid giving them emotional fuel. Show no interest. Don't engage in gossip, arguments, or provocative topics. Keep interactions minimal. Limit conversations to necessary matters only. If a toxic colleague tries to provoke you by criticizing your work, calmly reply with, "I'll review it, thanks for the feedback," and move on. In practice, applying the grey rock method involves maintaining a neutral facial expression, speaking in a monotone voice, and offering only the bare minimum of information. For example, if a toxic colleague attempts to draw you into gossip or provoke an emotional response, a simple, non-committal reply like, "I see," or "interesting," without further engagement, can quickly diffuse the situation. Over time, the lack of drama or reaction makes the toxic person lose interest and seek attention elsewhere. However, while this method can be effective, it is important to balance it with self-awareness. Prolonged use of the grey rock technique in situations where it's unnecessary can lead to emotional exhaustion or feelings of detachment. Therefore, it is best used selectively, ensuring that you protect your mental well-being while still maintaining control over interactions with toxic individuals. Ultimately, the grey rock method empowers smart people by allowing them to navigate difficult interactions without getting dragged into negativity or unnecessary conflict. It's a subtle but powerful way to assert control and maintain emotional balance in challenging situations. Number 5. Ask probing questions. Instead of getting defensive when dealing with a toxic person, smart people often disarm them by asking questions that prompt introspection and disrupt their usual patterns of interaction. This tactic shifts the power dynamic by forcing the toxic person to reflect on their behavior, which they may not be accustomed to doing. Stay curious, not accusatory. Use open-ended questions to make them explain their behavior. Remain calm and neutral. Ask questions in a non-confrontational manner. Encourage self-reflection. Questions like, "Why do you feel that way?" or "Can you explain what you mean by that?" can catch them off guard. If someone makes a hurtful comment, you could ask, "What do you hope to achieve by saying that?" Asking the right type of questions helps in several ways. First, it changes the tone of the conversation from combative to inquisitive, which can de-escalate tension. Questions such as, "What made you say that?" or "Why do you feel that way?" encourage the toxic person to explain themselves rather than continuing their negative behavior unchecked. Second, it prevents smart people from falling into the trap of defensiveness, which toxic individuals often exploit to gain control of the interaction. In addition, open-ended questions that require thought can expose the flaws in the toxic person's logic or attitude. When faced with questions like, "Can you help me understand what you mean by that?" they may realize that their behavior is baseless or unjustified, leading them to back down. Smart people use a calm tone and neutral body language while asking these questions to ensure they don't come across as confrontational. Furthermore, by maintaining curiosity rather than judgment, smart individuals subtly shift the interaction from one of conflict to one of problem-solving. Even if the toxic person does not engage constructively, the act of asking questions can serve as a boundary-setting tool, signaling that manipulative tactics will not be met with emotional reactions. Ultimately, by asking thoughtful, non-defensive questions, smart people gain the upper hand in interactions with toxic individuals. This strategy not only protects their emotional well-being, but also encourages a more reflective dialogue, reducing the likelihood of future toxic encounters. Number 6. Limit exposure. Smart people recognize that one of the simplest and most effective ways to deal with toxicity is to limit their exposure to it. Toxic individuals often seek to dominate conversations, control interactions, or drain others emotionally. By minimizing time spent around them, smart people can maintain their energy levels, focus on positive relationships, and reduce stress. While complete avoidance may not always be possible, especially in work or family environments, consciously reducing interactions can significantly improve overall well-being. Prioritize your time. Spend more time with positive, supportive people. Politely decline. Don't feel obligated to attend events or engage in activities with toxic individuals. Create physical distance. If possible, physically remove yourself from situations where you have to interact with them. If a toxic friend constantly drains your energy, start declining their invitations and focus on spending time with people who uplift you. One important tactic is to evaluate the nature of each interaction. Smart people prioritize necessary engagements while avoiding unnecessary socializing with toxic individuals. For instance, they might limit communication to essential matters only, ensuring that conversations remain task-oriented and free of emotional manipulation. Additionally, they create buffer zones by surrounding themselves with supportive, positive individuals who uplift and energize them. This social buffer helps mitigate the emotional toll that toxic people can have and reinforces a healthier mental state. Moreover, smart people develop polite but firm ways to decline invitations or requests from toxic individuals. Whether it's through scheduling conflicts or a simple respectful, "I can't make it this time," they maintain control over how they spend their time. Ultimately, by consciously limiting exposure and curating their social interactions, smart people cultivate an environment that fosters growth, positivity, and peace of mind. This proactive approach allows them to navigate life with greater clarity and emotional resilience, making it harder for toxic individuals to have any lasting impact. Number 7. Focus on facts, not feelings. Toxic people often try to manipulate situations by twisting facts, spreading misinformation, or appealing to emotions in ways designed to provoke a reaction. They may attempt to confuse others by mixing half-truths with exaggerations, making it difficult to discern reality from fiction. Smart people counter these tactics by staying focused on verifiable facts and objective information. Stick to objective truths. Don't get drawn into emotional debates. Avoid speculation. If someone accuses you of something unfounded, ask for specifics. Stay grounded. Keep the conversation centered on what can be proven. If someone falsely accuses you of being something you're not, calmly respond with, "Actually, I've been honest and transparent. Could you clarify what you mean?" When toxic individuals twist the narrative, smart people resist the urge to get drawn into emotionally charged debates. Instead, they calmly request clarity or evidence to support any claims being made. This approach not only neutralizes manipulative tactics, but also forces the toxic person to confront the inconsistencies in their arguments. For example, a smart person might say, "Can you provide specific examples of what you mean?" Or, "Let's focus on what we know to be true." By keeping the conversation anchored in factual information, smart individuals reduce the influence of emotional manipulation. They refrain from engaging in speculative discussions or arguments based on assumptions, which toxic people often use to derail conversations. Staying factual also helps maintain a sense of control and prevents the interaction from escalating into an unproductive argument. Furthermore, smart people use active listening to identify the core issues behind a toxic person's behavior. By reflecting back factual elements of what was said, they demonstrate that they are paying attention without giving in to emotional baiting. This not only keeps the discussion on track, but also subtly reinforces the importance of honest, factual communication. Ultimately, by prioritizing facts over feelings, smart people create a stable foundation for interactions, making it harder for toxic individuals to manipulate or distort the truth. This strategy helps preserve their mental clarity and ensures that they can navigate challenging situations with confidence and composure. Number 8. Master the art of silence. Silence is a powerful tool when dealing with toxic people, as it serves multiple purposes in diffusing conflict and maintaining personal control. By refusing to engage, you deprive toxic individuals of the reaction they seek, which often fuels their need for attention or drama. Silence creates a pause that can disrupt the toxic person's momentum, forcing them to reconsider their approach or lose interest altogether. Pause before responding. Sometimes a thoughtful silence can speak louder than words. Use silence as a boundary. If someone is being disrespectful, remain silent to signal that their behavior is unacceptable. Walk away. Silence followed by walking away can end a toxic interaction instantly. If someone tries to provoke you in a meeting, simply pause, remain silent, and resume speaking when you're ready. Additionally, strategic silence allows smart people to protect their mental space. It acts as a barrier that prevents toxic remarks from escalating into full-blown arguments. Instead of responding to provocative comments or getting drawn into heated exchanges, they remain calm and let silence speak for itself. This not only signals emotional resilience, but also conveys that they are not easily manipulated. Moreover, silence can be used as a form of boundary setting. When someone continues to behave disrespectfully despite previous warnings, maintaining silence sends a clear message. Their behavior will not be rewarded with attention or engagement. Over time, this can condition the toxic person to reduce their negative behavior as they realize it yields no result. However, mastering the art of silence requires practice. Smart people learn to distinguish between moments when silence is effective and situations where speaking up is necessary to assert their stance or clarify boundaries. They also use silence intentionally, pairing it with composed body language and thoughtful pauses to enhance its impact. In meetings or group settings, silence can be a powerful way to regain control of a conversation. For example, if someone tries to undermine them publicly, pausing before responding not only demonstrates confidence, but also unsettles the toxic individual, who may expect an immediate defensive reaction. Ultimately, by employing silence thoughtfully, smart people navigate interactions with toxic individuals in a way that preserves their energy and mental clarity. It is a subtle yet powerful strategy that helps them maintain control over their emotional responses and, by extension, the overall dynamic of the interaction. Number 9. Respond, don't react. Reacting impulsively often gives toxic people the upper hand, as it plays directly into their tactics of seeking control or attention. Impulsive reactions are usually driven by emotion, which toxic individuals can exploit to further manipulate or escalate the situation. Smart people, however, take a moment to assess the situation carefully and respond thoughtfully instead, ensuring they maintain control over their emotions and the direction of the interaction. One way they do this is by pausing before speaking or acting. This brief pause allows them to gather their thoughts, regulate their emotions, and choose a response that aligns with their values and goals, rather than reacting out of frustration or anger. For instance, if someone makes a provocative comment, instead of immediately firing back, they might take a few seconds to breathe deeply and respond with a calm, measured statement that deflects the negativity. This delay not only prevents escalation, but also shows emotional maturity, which can further frustrate the toxic person who was seeking a quick reaction. Pause and reflect. Take a deep breath before replying. Choose your words carefully. Aim for clarity and calmness. Stay in control. Focus on what you can control, your response. If someone sends you a provocative message, wait a few minutes before replying with a composed, factual response. In addition, smart people focus on staying grounded in the present moment during tense interactions. They consciously avoid letting past grievances or future worries influence their responses. By keeping their attention on the current exchange and what can be constructively addressed, they prevent toxic individuals from dragging them into unnecessary emotional turmoil. They might practice techniques such as grounding exercises, which involve focusing on their senses, what they can see, hear, or feel, to stay present and composed. Furthermore, thoughtful responses often include elements of empathy and assertiveness. Smart people acknowledge the other person's perspective without necessarily agreeing with it, which helps to de-escalate tension. At the same time, they assert their own boundaries and viewpoints firmly but respectfully, ensuring that they communicate clearly without being drawn into conflict. For example, they might say, "I understand where you're coming from, but I have a different perspective," which validates the other person's feelings while maintaining their own stance. Smart people also recognize that not every situation requires a response. Sometimes, the most thoughtful response is no response at all. By choosing to remain silent or disengage when an interaction is unlikely to lead to a positive outcome, they conserve their energy and focus on more constructive matters. This discernment comes with experience and self-awareness, which they cultivate through reflection and personal growth. Ultimately, by taking the time to pause, assess, and thoughtfully choose their words and actions, smart people maintain their composure and protect their mental well-being. This approach not only minimizes the impact of toxic interactions, but also reinforces their ability to handle future situations with grace and confidence. Over time, this practice becomes second nature, allowing them to navigate even the most challenging interactions with poise and self-assurance. Number 10. Keep your self-esteem high. Toxic individuals often target those they perceive as weak or insecure because they see an opportunity to control or manipulate someone who lacks confidence. By building and maintaining high self-esteem, smart people make themselves less vulnerable to such tactics. High self-esteem acts as a protective shield, making it easier to recognize when someone is attempting to undermine or manipulate them and respond appropriately. Smart people develop their self-esteem by consistently reinforcing a positive self-image. This involves acknowledging their accomplishments, embracing their strengths, and accepting their flaws without allowing these to define their worth. They understand that true self-esteem is not about perfection, but about self-acceptance and resilience in the face of criticism. Moreover, they actively seek out environments and relationships that foster positivity and personal growth. Surrounding themselves with supportive and encouraging individuals helps reinforce their sense of self-worth, making it harder for toxic people to penetrate their emotional defenses. They also engage in activities that boost their confidence, such as learning new skills, pursuing hobbies, and setting achievable goals that promote a sense of accomplishment. In moments when toxic individuals attempt to belittle or demean them, smart people rely on their internal confidence to remain unaffected. They remind themselves of their intrinsic value and may even use affirmations to reinforce positive beliefs about themselves. This practice helps them maintain their composure and respond to negativity with confidence rather than defensiveness. Ultimately, By cultivating a strong sense of self-esteem, smart people make it clear to toxic individuals that they will not be easily manipulated or controlled. This not only reduces the likelihood of being targeted, but also enhances their ability to navigate challenging interactions with grace and self-assurance. Practice self-affirmation. Regularly remind yourself of your strengths and achievements. Surround yourself with positivity. Spend time with people who appreciate and uplift you. Focus on personal growth. Invest in activities that enhance your confidence and skills. When someone tries to belittle you, remind yourself of your value and respond confidently. Number 11. Find humor in the situation. Humor can be a powerful way to diffuse tension and disarm toxic individuals, as it helps shift the mood of an interaction from conflict to lightheartedness. Toxic people often thrive on creating negative emotional reactions in others, but humor can act as an unexpected and disarming tool, diffusing their control over the situation. Keep it light. Use humor to lighten the mood without being sarcastic or mean. Laugh it off. Sometimes, simply laughing at a ridiculous comment can neutralize it. Use self-deprecating humor. This shows confidence and can disarm attempts to belittle you. If someone makes a snide remark, you might say with a smile, "Well, I guess I'll add that to my list of quirks." Smart people use humor thoughtfully, ensuring that it is appropriate to the context and doesn't escalate the tension. For example, self-deprecating humor can show confidence and poise, signaling to the toxic individual that their attempts to undermine or provoke are ineffective. Light-hearted jokes or witty remarks can also serve as a way to redirect the conversation and steer it away from negativity. Additionally, humor can help smart people maintain their own emotional balance. Laughing at a situation or finding something amusing in a toxic person's behavior can reduce stress and prevent them from internalizing negative comments. This not only protects their mental well-being, but also demonstrates that they are not easily rattled. In group settings, humor can be especially useful in maintaining social harmony. If a toxic person attempts to dominate or create conflict, a well-timed joke can break the tension and refocus everyone's attention on something more positive. This can subtly undermine the toxic individual's efforts to gain control while keeping the atmosphere light. Ultimately, by using humor as a tool, smart people deflect negativity, maintain control over their emotional state, and foster a more positive environment. However, they are careful not to use humor in a way that could be perceived as mocking or confrontational, as this could exacerbate the situation rather than diffuse it. Number 12. Maintain a sense of control. Smart people ensure they remain in control of their thoughts, emotions, and reactions when dealing with toxic individuals. Toxic people often seek to provoke emotional responses or manipulate the tone of interactions to their advantage. By staying mindful and composed, smart individuals effectively prevent toxic people from dictating the flow of conversations or influencing their mood, thereby maintaining their own sense of stability. To achieve this, smart people practice mindfulness regularly, which helps them stay present and aware of their emotional state during interactions. This awareness allows them to recognize potential triggers early and choose their responses deliberately rather than reacting impulsively. For example, if a toxic person attempts to provoke them with criticism or sarcasm, they pause, take a deep breath, and respond thoughtfully, ensuring they don't feed into the negativity. Another strategy they use is emotional regulation. This involves acknowledging their feelings without letting those emotions control their behavior. Smart people understand that feeling anger or frustration is natural, but acting on those emotions impulsively can escalate the situation. By practicing emotional regulation techniques such as deep breathing, counting to 10, or briefly stepping away from the conversation, They regain control over their emotions and approach the situation with a clear mind. In addition, they focus on maintaining a solution-oriented mindset. Rather than getting bogged down in the toxic person's negativity, they steer conversations toward productive outcomes. This shift in focus not only helps them maintain control, but also signals to the toxic individual that attempts to derail the interaction will not succeed. Ultimately, by combining mindfulness, emotional regulation, and a solution-focused approach, smart people navigate interactions with toxic individuals calmly and confidently. They safeguard their mental well-being while subtly asserting control over the dynamic of the interaction, ensuring that they remain unaffected by external negativity. Stay mindful. Practice mindfulness to stay present and avoid reacting impulsively. Control your environment. Limit access toxic people have to your personal space or time. Set personal goals. Focus on your own priorities to keep your life on track, regardless of external negativity. When faced with a toxic person's attempt to stir conflict, take a deep breath, stay calm, and redirect the conversation towards something productive. Number 13. Know when to walk away. Sometimes the best strategy is to walk away. Smart people recognize that not all battles are worth fighting, and they understand the importance of conserving their energy for more meaningful pursuits. When a relationship or situation becomes consistently toxic and shows no signs of improvement despite honest communication and boundary setting, they choose to prioritize their mental well-being over maintaining harmful connections. Recognize red flags. Pay attention to consistent patterns of toxic behavior. Make a clean break. If necessary, cut off contact completely. Focus on healing. After walking away, invest time in self-care and personal growth. If a friend repeatedly disrespects your boundaries despite multiple conversations, it might be time to end the friendship. Walking away doesn't mean giving up. Rather, it reflects a deep understanding of self-worth and the courage to distance oneself from negativity. Smart individuals carefully evaluate whether the relationship adds value to their life or merely causes stress and emotional turmoil. If it's the latter, they acknowledge that detaching is sometimes necessary for personal growth. In situations where complete disconnection isn't feasible, such as at work or with certain family members, they create emotional and mental distance by limiting interactions and remaining emotionally detached. This form of walking away ensures they retain control over their peace of mind while fulfilling unavoidable obligations. Ultimately, walking away is an act of self-respect. Smart people understand that letting go of toxic relationships opens up space for healthier, more supportive connections. They focus on healing, building resilience, and investing in relationships that nurture their well-being, allowing them to thrive in a more positive environment. Dealing with toxic people is a skill that can be developed over time. By using these 13 clever tactics, you can protect your peace, maintain control over your life, and ensure that negativity doesn't take root in your mind. Remember, the goal is not to change toxic individuals, but to safeguard your well-being and thrive despite their presence. With practice, you'll find that dealing with toxic people becomes less stressful and more manageable. Stay calm, stay confident, stay stoic, and keep focusing on the positive aspects of your life.